What's up, everybody? December 15th. I am so excited for this. So the next big production that we're working on is a stage play called Termination Fee. It's going to be a film too, but it's going to be a stage play. We're hoping to take it to Edinburgh in 2025. And here's the really cool part. On December 15th, 7 p.m., Flappers Comedy Club in Burbank, we're going to be previewing part 1 of Termination Fee. I'm going to be there. Sarah K. Godot is going to be there. Andrew Saxon is going to be there. Graham Owen's going to be there. There's going to be a night of stand-up. So some stand-up sets to open the night, followed by part 1 of Termination Fee and a Q&A after if we got the time for it. So get your tickets now, romplacone.com. December 15th, Flappers Comedy Club, Los Angeles. See you there. Episode 61. Thomas Frank. Thomas Frank is a political analyst and writer. He wrote the book Listen Liberal, a thorough but fair dissection of the failures of the Democratic establishment, and in particular the Obama administration. He also wrote The People Know, which provides a factual analysis on what populism actually is. In the contemporary political landscape we're living in, he's one of the most important thinkers out there. I try not to be too topical with this show, as that's not the theme, but we recorded this interview a week after Donald Trump's 2024 victory. Whether you're listening the day it drops or years from now, I hope it's a solid snapshot of where we are or were. Please welcome to the show, Thomas Frank. Thomas Frank, how are you? It's been a long time. Good to see you. What a time to get together.
Well, Ron, yes. Yeah, you might say that. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. So
I understand you're onto an extremely ambitious project.
Yes. Yeah. 1,000 people. You are among the 1,000. So welcome. And we're gonna do a deep dive into everything, and we're definitely gonna get a little topical too, because how can't we? We are recording this in mid-November 2024. For anyone who might be visiting this years from now, but let's start at the beginning. You are such an intriguing guy. How did you get into everything that you're into? How did you get interested in history, politics? I know you're a music guy too. We have a lot of similar
that's
interests,
a different lifetime there.
Sure. But kind of give me the snapshot. How did you get into all this?
Well, I knew I had to. So I knew two things from my earliest childhood. One was I had to be a writer, and the other is history was my natural subject. I used to go around in Kansas City and on my bike. This is like in elementary school. And I would try to guess the dates when buildings were built. This was my project. It was just like, that's, so I've always been past minded. So history is a natural, and writing is like, I just knew that was what I was going to do with myself. And then somewhere along the way, my friends and I decided, well, let's start a literary magazine. This was in college, and we did it. And I mean, this is kind of a common dream that you find among college students, right?
Where was college?
UVA. Oh, sorry,
okay.
The University of Virginia.
So Richmond.
And, no, it's in Charlottesville.
Oh, it's in Charlottesville.
Yeah, and right. I mean, I had a great time in college, like everybody does. It's a wonderful experience and all that, but. My friends and I, we did this. We launched a literary magazine. Every undergraduate back in those days had a fantasy like that. What's weird is that we actually succeeded with it. It's now that I look back in retrospect, and it just seems crazy. And so that it actually worked. But I did. Then I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, continued to do the magazine, managed the student radio station. I used to be really into punk rock. This was my thing back then.
Me too.
And I managed the radio station at the University of Chicago, the student radio station, and which was a great experience. And did the magazine at the same time, and did a PhD in American history, which I don't generally talk about because I don't think credentials are important. That's one of my peculiarities. Anyhow, so that, how when you're that age, when you're young, your brain is just like, it's just running a mile a minute, and you're interested in so many different things. And I was interested in at least two huge topics at the same time. One was sort of youth culture, 1960s, and the other was political culture from the 1890s. So why would I be interested in that? Is because I come from Kansas and they had this movement called populism. And I knew, I mean, everybody in Kansas has heard that word and they know that it was a big deal once in the state, but they don't know anything about it. And so I decided to educate myself up on it. And I studied it and studied it. Now, I never, at the time, I didn't write about it very much because it turned out when I was in graduate school that everybody, this is in the 1980s, everybody was interested in populism. Everybody wanted to write about it. And so I was like, no, I gotta find a subject that's all my own. So I after learning all about populism, I walked away from it, but this comes back later in the story.
Populism I
eventually became kind of the motif of my life. But so instead, I wrote about youth culture and this big question that I had in the 90s. And so I had, like I said, I had been really huge fan of punk rock, really followed it, played the records on the radio.
So what was
shows,
kind of
interviewed the bands?
Yeah. What was kind of in the zeitgeist when you were doing that?
Well, this was the Nirvana thing happened. So I was in the 80s. I was really into this stuff, and then in 91, the Nirvana bomb dropped, and all of a sudden, I mean, this is I had met those guys when they played in Chicago in like 89. And because one of my friends was this huge fan of Seattle music. Right. And so, I had met them. They were part of our world, generally speaking. And then there's this crazy moment where all of a sudden, the mainstream commercial music world went crazy about these guys, and every band, and I'll never forget. I went over to the radio station that day. Somebody had clipped out the top records from whatever newspaper, Chicago Tribune or whatever, and put it on the bulletin board. And Nirvana had displaced Michael Jackson as number one. And we were all, none of us we couldn't understand it, right? Because this was this world where, everybody was this was indie label music. Everybody was putting out their own records or putting them out on these tiny little records. Nobody ever had any kind of broad cultural impact like that. It was like our own little world. And then all of a sudden, our own little world had triumphed over the biggest superstar of them all, Michael Jackson. And none of us could understand it. We couldn't really get our minds around it. And I was doing the Baffler magazine at the time. And so we decided to, this is what we just became obsessed with it. And we, the way the culture, the broader sort of mainstream commercial culture conquered, I would say, indie rock. And they did it very quickly in like 2 or 3 years. And so I had a front row seat at this. I was watching it happen. Friends of mine got signed to major labels, all sorts of crazy stuff like this. And so I was writing about it all the time. And I eventually decided that this should be my subject in a broader sense. And so I wrote about the sort of similar, the way this played out in the 1960s. And if you ever read 1960s history books or anything about the 1960s, everybody is fascinated by this. Like, why did the mainstream culture suddenly become hip and cool in the late 60s? How did that happen? And usually, and there's a lot of bad faith arguing about this. And they accuse the mainstream culture of wanting to co-opt, the 60s, the youth culture because it was so revolutionary or something like that. And I was like, that doesn't sound right to me. So I decided I would study. And by the way, Ron, tell me when to shut up because
no, this is great.
You really got me going here. I could talk about this stuff for hours. I decided I would flip the question on its head, and I would study. Instead of studying the co-opted, I would study the co-opters. I would study the advertising industry and ask, why did they do this? Why did coolness, why did hipness suddenly become so important to them? And the result, I wrote, this was I I'll say it. It was my dissertation.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
And it became my first book. It was called The Conquest of Cool.
Okay.
I still love that title. The Conquest
That is a cool title.
How they conquered coolness. And I mainly studied the advertising industry, and it was fun. I hate to admit this too. I really like doing research. I really like digging in archives. I really like interviewing people who were there. I love it, as a matter of fact. And
well, I'd argue you're pretty good at it. I mean,
yeah, it's one of my skills.
You've done okay.
I do love libraries. I just love them. And the University of Chicago Library is one of these, it's one of the great libraries of the world. And at the time, I assume it's still this way, but who knows? It was what they call open stacks. So you just went in there, right? And then I would go in there in the morning. I'd come out again, and the sun would have set. It's like I've been in there all day researching this stuff. Anyhow, I had a wonderful time doing that. I loved it. And I discovered, and the book, by the way, succeeded. I mean, commercial. It was a university press book, University of Chicago Press. But the book succeeded, which was a big surprise to everyone. But that wasn't good enough for academia, right? So at the same time as all this was happening, academia's history departments and stuff like that was kind of falling apart, and they weren't hiring anybody anymore. And I was on the job market for several years, had a lot of, didn't get anywhere with that. And so I said, the hell with this. I'm going to be a professional writer. I'm pretty good at this. This is what I'm going to do. Anyhow, it's a long story, but I decided first I would write about business culture. So, I wrote a book about this was the time by this time it's the late 90s. This crazy stock market bubble was going on. I don't know if you remember this. I'm older than you, but there was this insane moment in the late 90s where the whole culture, like the Nirvana moment, only slightly different, the whole culture went crazy about internet stocks. And it was as far as we know, it's a lot. Well, nobody was around in the 1920s to tell us about it, but it seemed like it was repeating all of these sort of tropes and language and all that from the stock market bubble of the 1920s. So I wrote about that. It was called "One Market Under God." I'm very proud of that title too.
That is a cool. Yeah, you're. I mean, all of your titles could also be punk albums. Yeah, that's what. Like, listen,
thank
liberal.
You. That is a high compliment.
Yeah.
And anyhow, so after I did that, it was clear to me that I was also telling a political story. This was the years of the Clinton administration, bank deregulation, all those things were happening. And it was clear that this was also a political story. How had Americans come to fall in love with the stock market and with business culture? Isn't that strange that we did that after, these people routinely screwed us? So I wondered about that. How did ordinary people come around to this? And that's in a sort of roundabout way. That's the story of What's the Matter with Kansas. That was my next effort, was to understand how ordinary people could sign up for a political project, a political economic project that is just going to screw them, And I remember the moment that the light bulb went. I knew the title, What's the Matter? I had the title before I had the book, because the title is, if you study populism, which I had, this title, What's the Matter with Kansas, is very famous. This guy wrote, Kansas was a big populist state, which was, just for the record, populism was a kind of a radical left-wing farmer movement. It was not some kind of proto-fascism.
It was
not even close to that. It was the opposite of that. Somehow that all got flipped on its head.
We're going to dive into people know here in a bit. I have some questions. So
my wife's had enough of my bullshit. She just closed the door. I'm so loud. She didn't want to hear this nonsense. But anyhow,
my wife's the same way, man. That's how it goes.
Yeah, but so that's, I had the title. I remember reading Chicago Tribune or something. This would have been in what year? Like in the late 90s. And there was an article about in Kansas they were fighting over the theory of evolution. And I couldn't believe it. I'm from Kansas, and it's not Tennessee in the 1920s, right? It's a highly educated state, right? And it was embarrassing to me and shocking and strange, and I had to investigate it. I had to understand what was going on, how my home state, how this could have happened, and so I basically moved back into my dad's house in Kansas City and was there for a couple of years and wrote, and interviewed all of these leaders of the right wing sort of culture war movement. By the way, and that's always important to me is you got to. I mean, it doesn't happen as much anymore because they know who I am now, but back then they didn't. And so I interviewed everybody. Right, I went around the state with my tape recorder and I interviewed everybody, and wrote that book. Right, and again, to my enormous surprise, it was a success. And then what made it, and then it came out in, I think, spring of 2004. And it at first got very bad reviews. People were like, how you can't write a book with this title. You can't say things like this about people, even if you're from there, right? Even if you're one of them, you can't say this. And then the election happened, right? And, George W. Bush, and that it was an insane moment.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Yeah, and then from then on, I became I had a career as a pundit for about 10 years. As I was a pundit, and I wrote about it again and again. I even had a column in the Wall Street Journal for a while. Oh, and
how would you, if you had to describe what you do to somebody, what would you say if you just really had to give the cliff notes? Like, would you say writer, historian, a little bit of everything? Like, what would you say?
I guess I would say, it confuses people to say I'm a historian because they associate that with actually being a professor of history, and I'm not. So I've never tried to go back to academia. I'm just a writer who likes to dig in archives and has a large amount of knowledge about the 1890s for reasons that we don't nobody really gets.
Well, so let's get into populism and specifically, like, especially because what's going on now. So you wrote. By the way, I just read an article in this morning's Guardian. I wrote for the Guardian too, somewhere along the way, and it was a very good article. The guy was trying to describe Donald Trump's victory, and he was onto something. It was a really good article. And then at the end of it, he described Donald Trump parking his populist tanks on someone's lawn, and I'm like, come on, like, why ruin? I mean, come on. But this is Europeans. They have no understanding of what that term means to us. So what
to the people who invented it?
Yeah. So give like a brief historical analysis. Like, what is populism all about? Because I've read your book, and I've always been like, wow, people are really, misinterpreting and kind of hijacking in some ways populism.
The term has come to it confuses people so much, so, like I said, I did all of this research on populism, this movement in Kansas in the 1890s. It was all over America. It wasn't just in Kansas. Kansas was the state that that was sort of the hotbed of it, sort of the center of it. It was a left-wing farmer labor party. It was the last successful effort to start a third-party movement in America. By successful, I mean they elected people, across, they elected people up and down the ticket. We had 2 populist governors in Kansas. We had a number of senators, members of Congress, sheriffs, whatever, populists all over the place. And this was all over the Midwest. You had, populists, members of this third party. Is that a cat?
Yeah, that's my cat. That's Lucy.
You had populists winning elections. Their candidates for president never really had a chance, but they did try. And they were also big in the South. Those were the two regions where they had a certain amount of success. But I was able to pinpoint the exact week in which they invented the word populism. So when they started out, they didn't really have a name for themselves. They came out of this movement, a farmers' movement that was called the Farmers Alliance in the 1880s. It was like a farmers' union. And this farmers' union grew very disgusted with the two-party system. They couldn't, it was an enormous movement, but they still couldn't get the two parties to do what they wanted. Even though they were the biggest, force on the ground at the time, they still couldn't get their agenda anywhere. And so they decided in the year 1890 to, as they put it, go into politics, by which they meant start their own party. And they met with success very quickly. They swept the Kansas legislature and a bunch of other state legislatures. And then they had to come up with a name for themselves. And the name they were using at the beginning was the People's Party. But they realized right away that wasn't going to go very far. That's not a great name. And a couple guys in Kansas one day were casting about looking for a name, and they came up with this word populist. They were riding on a train one day in May of 1891, and one of them knew some Latin, and the word for the people in Latin is populus. And so they said, well, how about populists? And they put it in one of their newspapers a few days later. And I was, this is the back when I was doing this research originally in the 1980s, to read these newspapers was, populists had a lot of newspapers. Every small town in Kansas would have a Republican paper and a populist paper, and they would go at it with each other, And so they had newspapers all over the place. And so in the 1980s, to read these newspapers was very difficult. You had to get them on microfilm, and you had to, read every issue if you want to find what you're looking for. Now, they are online. They are available online. And you can do text searches. I am not kidding. So it was actually fairly easy to find the first use of this word in print. And it was a newspaper that I was very familiar with, this radical newspaper out of anyhow, that's where the word came from. And they right away flew directly into sort of an incredible can I curse on your show?
You can.
Yeah, just an absolute shitstorm. The two main parties just had at them in this kind of incredible way. Called the word communist wasn't there yet, so they couldn't really, the word existed, but it didn't scare anybody because the Russian Revolution hadn't happened yet. So typically they would compare them to the French Revolution. They'd compare them to Robespierre or whatever. And they ran right, headlong into this attack on them, in which their enemies would try to redefine populism, this word populism, as meaning like a demagogue from the French Revolution, a kind of a hypnotist, someone with this ability to sway, a demagogue. And that's how, and so their enemies redefined the word. These are their enemies, meaning the conservatives of the 1890s, very conservative people associated with Wall Street, whatever the local business power was. And so they tried to redefine populism in that way. Anyhow, so most Americans knew, roughly speaking, what populism was through the 1930s. The word would routinely be used correctly to describe this farmer labor movement up until, until that generation of people who had participated in it were dead and gone. And then you see these guys, group of historians. Do you want me to talk about this, or should we talk more about what the populists were and what they did, or does anybody care?
Well, no. I mean, keep going chronologically because.
Okay.
I want to get to how it has been totally. I think it's fair to say bastardized in our current climate, and I want to just work up to the current.
Yeah. So so they had a fascinating run. They lasted for about 10 years. They had a lot of success in Midwestern states. In the South, they did not have as much because although there were a lot of them, the South was extremely corrupt at the time. It was a one-party system run by the Democratic Party, and it was a racist system that the Democrats ran. Jim Crow hadn't really started yet. We'll come to that part of the story, but it was on its way, and the masters of the South, they kept their power through racist appeals, and so the populists in the South tried to confront that and tried to reach out to black farmers as well as white farmers, mainly meaning sharecroppers, and enlist them in their crusade. And they had a lot of success, but the corruption in the South was too much for them, and they could never really overcome it except in one state, which was North Carolina, where they managed to win. But the powers that be in the South eventually proved too much for them and used their racist appeals and destroyed populism. And that's, by the way, that's where Jim Crow comes from. They said after this is done, the sort of leaders of the South, the white, they used to call them the Bourbons, the ruling class of the South, said, we never want to face this kind of situation again, where you have the poor people of both races, coming together against us. This can never be permitted to happen again. And so they instituted all of these laws to basically, segregation starts then, or it advanced a lot, but most importantly to keep black people from voting, and a lot of poor whites as well. And they succeeded. I mean, it never did happen again until, for like 100 years. That was successful. But in other places, the populists won. In Kansas, they kept winning. Nebraska, the Dakotas, Texas, oddly enough, places like this. And the climactic moment for them came in. So as the 1890s went along, the country fell into a terrible recession. And this seemed to be, this was the moment, right? The populists were this left-wing party that was complaining about the economy, and all of a sudden the economy broke down, and it looked like the populists were going to, it's like the Sanders movement. All of a sudden it looks like these guys might win. Mm-hmm. And there was this huge, there were several enormous strikes. One of them was as close as this country's ever come to a general strike. It was called the Pullman strike. It was a railroad strike, came out of Chicago. The leader of it was a guy called Eugene Debs, who was a populist at the time. He later became famous as a socialist, but at the time he was a populist. There was a march on Washington of unemployed people led by a populist. This is all in like 1894. And so the country is the conservative powers, the people who owned America, were very, very worried. And they said, this is the class war. The class war is here. And it's the name that they gave to the class war was populism. And there's, I have all sorts of very funny illustrations and political cartoons from that period in the People Know, illustrating this. So then the craziest damn thing happens. 1896 is a national election year. It looks like it's going to be, the populists, you've got three parties now, a three-party system, and it looks like the populists are going to do really well. And then the Democrats meet for their convention. They go first, and they nominate this guy, William Jennings Bryan. He's 36 years old, one-term congressman from Nebraska, who talks like a populist and is personal friends with a lot of populists. And he swipes one of their main issues, which has to do with the gold standard. And he wants to take America off the gold standard, which that's one of the many things the populists had wanted to do. And he's a magnetic personality. He's extremely charismatic, and he's this great orator. And the country looks at him and they're like, wow, this guy, this is a man of destiny. And the populists then meet for their convention, and they say, look, this guy is mimicking us, and he just stole our main issue. What are we going to do? And so they said, well, we'll endorse him as well. And this was it was a fateful decision. They argued about it. there's a lot of recriminations. Should we go with the Democrats? Should we not? A lot of populists hated the Democrats. They did it though. They got on board with the Bryan train. And then the Republicans nominated their guy, McKinley, who was advised by he's very conservative. By the way, Donald Trump really admires McKinley. This is it's just weird, everything comes full circle. But McKinley is a huge tariffs man. He loves tariffs. The populists and Bryan are free traders, by the way. But McKinley's a tariff guy. And he has behind him, he has all the great economic powers of the day, and is advised, or you would say was a puppet of this Cleveland tycoon called Mark Hanna. And Mark Hanna is sort of the original version of this sort of power behind the throne that we always identify with the Republican Party. Like you think Lee Atwater, Karl Rove, Steve Bannon. He's the original Mark Hanna, and he's a genius political sort of fighter.
Bad guy.
yeah, but
he's a genius bad guy.
Yes, and he's extremely good at it. Oh my God, he's diabolical. And he organizes the most incredible campaign. And the word that he uses to beat Bryan down is populism. He says, I know. Yeah. Bryan is a populist, he says. Populists are the French Revolution. Populists are anarchists. Populists are, they want to abolish private property. Populism is an uprising of the unfit. It's of the village, like the village atheist trying to overturn this sort of rightful order that has been established by God, the order of success, prosperity, brains, merit. And populism is the losers in this system, the unemployed, the screw ups, trying to say, no, we are the rightful rulers. And they this campaign is successful. And they do it, right? Then they beat Bryan, and with Bryan, they destroy populism. The Populist Party after that, they take to infighting. They're like, I told you we shouldn't have done it. I told you we shouldn't have gone with Bryan. And it was like, no, he was our best chance. And it's just a disaster. And that's basically the end of them. They sort of continue on for a few more years after that, but by 1900 they're more or less dead, and that's the end of it. But it's this great sort of political upheaval that fails and dies out, and we've never had anything of that scale ever since, unless you can think of the New Deal, right? But that's not a third party movement; that's the Democrats. But they, anyhow, that's the story of populism. And what's amazing is how the word gets recast.
Right. So how would you say
years later?
How would you say that happened? Now you hear people say things like right-wing populism.
I know.
It is an oxymoron.
I know, but it's like, well, but there are. So look, I'm a little bit guilty for this myself because these right wingers, this is what fascinates me about them, is that they're not like McKinley anymore. They don't say we have to beat down, that the unfit, the unemployed should have no voice, and people who don't own anything should just shut up and take it. And if they don't say that anymore. They act like populists themselves. Now it's fake. It's bullshit. The classic, there's many classic examples here. George W. Bush, right? With that Texas twang of his, right? Always pretending to be a man of the people. Or his dad. This is the one that really got me. In 1988, George Bush Sr. eating the pork rinds. Do you remember this? Touring the country with country western singers, visiting flag factories. God. And he was like the preppiest man in America, right? From this, he was he was a blue blood, and he's pretending to be a man of the people. And, but they got very good at this act. Ronald Reagan was very good at this act.
Literally an actor.
Yes. And that's an important part of the story. And that is, doing this act has really served them well. And then you come to Donald Trump, and he does it better than anybody, right? I mean, you look at J.D. Vance, or look at Trump himself. Trump himself it claims to be, right? He is the spokesman of the hard done by, these very people who have had their lives ruined. But no, he's not a populist. If you, by the word populist, you mean anything real, he's totally on the opposite side. For God's sakes, he loves William McKinley. He's a tariffs guy. He look at who he appointed to his. No, it's ridiculous. There's not a populist bone in his body. You look at the guys that he appointed to run his cabinet, right? The guys who he appointed to run the federal departments, and they're all straight out of business, Fortune 500. They're all his billionaire friends. His politics are just as conservative and right wing as it's possible to be, and I'm with you. When I first, and I've been writing about this stuff for a long time, and I had written about in What's the Matter with Kansas what I called fake populism, this kind of phony act that these right wingers do, like they're on your side when anybody can see that they aren't. All they want to do is cut taxes and deregulate Wall Street and, all this crap that they were doing in the 70s and 80s and 90s. That's who they are. That's what they do. And I actually remember when Trump was running and I first started hearing the word populist being applied to him as though he was unmodified. They didn't say right-wing populist. They didn't say fake populist. They just said populist. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't believe it. And then I started reading all of these, these political writers who said what populism is it's like a kind of like light version of fascism. And Donald Trump is a perfect example of it. And this burned me up. I mean, as you can imagine, I spent my life.
There's some people who think it's a synonym for racism.
Yes, and in fact, it was the opposite. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you where that. I mean, so there were some populists back then who, after populism died, who changed positions and became really bad people. I mean, there's some famous examples of this. There's a really famous one. One of their leaders from Georgia, who was, by the standards of the 1890s, like he was the leading anti-racist of the 1890s. He wrote articles about it and everything. And after his career was ruined, by this campaign to destroy populism, it's like 10 years later, after it's dead, he reemerges as, it's actually really interesting, he reemerges as the leading racist in America. And he really, it's an amazing story, but it doesn't tell you a lot about populism. What it tells you about is it's an old story of these reformers and crusaders who change sides after they are disappointed in life. And there's a long history of that, of people on the left.
Oh, we're seeing it right now.
Yeah.
We're seeing a ton of it right now.
People on the left who go over to the right. Yes. Mm-hmm. It's a very well-known story. That's not, typical of populism. That's this one guy, right? But he is interesting to historians, but that's not the story of populism. That's the story of this one guy. No, the real change is this group of American historians in the 1950s who went looking. They were very upset by McCarthyism. And they went looking for a word, an ism to describe McCarthy and McCarthyism that they could then apply to all sorts of different social movements. And the one they came up with was populism. And they did it for really bad reasons. There was a lot of bad academic faith and bad academic practice. The leader of this group was an American historian called Richard Hofstadter. And he actually wrote a book about populism as a proto-fascist movement. Now, his work it was very popular with the intellectuals, and they gave him the Pulitzer Prize, and he was the toast of the historical community. I used to read him when I was young. I thought he was, he's a great writer. In some ways, I really, to this day, really admire him because of his prose style. He was brilliant. but he was completely wrong about populism, and he got smacked down pretty hard. Other historians said, no, your interpretations are completely wrong. You haven't done the right research, etc. This is what happens in history land. And he got smacked down really hard. And within a few years after publishing his book about populism, he'd given up on it, and he wasn't talking about it anymore. But his interpretation, now this is the weird part of the story, his interpretation got picked up by Europeans. And I did a little research on this, and it's fascinating. They had a big conference in the 60s where the European intellectuals decided they needed to look into populism, this movement. They needed to understand it, and they invited Hofstadter. They didn't invite any other historians of populism, this American movement from the 1890s. They only invited one guy, and it was him. And the whole idea was to apply his totally discredited idea to right-wing parties all over the world. And they didn't even know that about, actual, like, real I'm sorry if I'm getting confusing here, but so for example, there's another American historian of populism who I really admire, a guy called Larry Goodwin. He wrote a huge book about it in the 70s. He did all sorts of research. I mean, it's the authoritative book. He did more research than anybody else. And he was alive until very recently. And he's a fascinating guy. He didn't just do research on populism. He tried to live it. He believed in it. And, he was involved in the civil rights movement. He tried to encourage his graduate students to do studies of people, of black voters who were involved in the civil rights. He was a great academic, a great scholar, a great man. He died recently. I got in touch with people who knew him, and I said, this word populism, how it's been reconfigured in this awful way. And they have these conferences about it every year in Europe, and they talk about it all the time. And did they ever invite him to those conferences? I mean, he's the greatest living authority on populism. Did they ever ask him about it? This person I talked to was like, of course not. Wow. Absolutely not. I mean, it's not real scholarship. They aren't really interested in it's a political gambit. It's a sort of a, it's a political game they're playing. No, they're not interested in the real deal. They're not interested in what the word means, and they're not interested in, this is what kills me. They're not interested in what populism really represented, which is left-wing reform from the bottom up. So popular movements for economic reform, for economic and social reform, that's the history. That's the only thing that's ever succeeded in this country. Populism, the New Deal, the labor movement, and the civil rights movement. This is what works. Okay. But if you say, no, populism means like quasi-fascism. If you say that, you're blinding yourself. You're closing your eyes to this whole history here in America. And that's the consequences of their bad history. That's the consequence of it, is that you think populism means Trump. No, populism means Roosevelt. Populism means the labor movement. Populism means Martin Luther King. By the way, King himself used to talk about this. It's very interesting. But if if you're not interested in that, then then you're stuck with this way of understanding politics where it's all about reform from the top down, about elites, coming together in DC and hammering out the details and giving the rest of us reform. And you're gonna miss the whole story of America, in my opinion. And that is in fact, I'm sorry, Ron, that's what happened. That is where we are right now.
Oh, yeah. So I want to fast forward a little bit to get where we are right now. But first, I want to spend a little bit of time on Listen Liberal. What made you decide that book was necessary? And for anyone who hasn't read it, kind of give a snapshot of that book.
So it was the working out. It's my love letter to the Democratic Party, just like what's the matter with Kansas was my little Valentine to the Republican Party, and so look, I wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, and there's a lot of ideas in that book. I was in my 30s when I wrote it, and I had so many ideas about the world, and some of them I worked out and some of them I didn't. But one of them that I didn't is that the Democrats are also to blame for this. And I think I have a chapter about that in What's the Matter with Kansas, and it's right at the end. But I don't fully articulate this idea, that the Democrats have become something very different from what they used to be. And in fact, in a lot of ways, they are the stereotype that these, I would talk to these culture war conservatives in Kansas, and they would talk about the Democrats always in this certain way. These know-it-all elites, these university educated guys, these professional whatever. And I sort of made fun of that. But at the same time, I would look at the Democratic Party and be like, that's kind of true. And I have like I say, a chapter about that in What's the Matter with Kansas. And I would always, in my books after that, I would say, I would hammer the Republicans. And then I would always have a chapter saying, but the Democrats do this too. And the Democrats have a lot to answer for. And after a while, I was like, I should be honest about this. If the Democrats have a lot to answer for, let's go and look it up. Let's do a book about that. Instead of just making it a chapter in these other things, let's do the narrative and let's do the research and let's talk to people and figure it out. And so that was Listen Liberal. And turns out there's consequences, Ron, to writing a book like that.
Has the good outweighed the bad for you?
I don't worry about me. I'm happy with my life and I'm happy with what I've done, and I'm proud of all the books that we're talking about here. I'm very proud of what I did, and I don't have any regrets about them. My research was good. My instincts, I think, looking back, were right. My theories turned out to be true. But the idea of Listen Liberal was that the Democrats are a party. They have become a party of what I call the professional class. Other people have different names for it. And but this means, in a broad sense, it means people who've graduated from college. In a more specific sense, it means that they respect academic credentials, and they prioritize the views of highly educated white collar elites over the views of ordinary people. So they are anti-populist. And what's funny is, as I started to do the research on this, not only did it turn out to be true, it turned out the Democrats themselves boasted about this. They talked about it openly. Once you start digging, you find evidence of this all over the place in the 70s, in the 80s, especially in the Clinton administration, especially in the Obama administration. They were very, very open about this. And once you understand this, all these other things about the Democrats become clear. Why do they keep letting us down? Why can't they, do what's obviously necessary when you're in these crisis situations? So at the time I wrote it, it was published in 2016. So I wrote it in the last years of the Obama administration, which was a very frustrating time for a lot of us. I had believed in Obama. Mm-hmm. I had even met him once in Chicago. He was my state senator in the neighborhood I lived in Chicago. And I had really I had thought he was great. Look, all of these books there's a certain amount of self-evaluation in them. I had believed in Obama. When he got elected, I said to myself, yeah, this guy, I've met him. He's super smart. He will appoint the right people. These Bush idiots, the George W. Bush crew were such fools. Obama will appoint smart people. He'll bring in people who know what's going on, and they'll get it right, and they'll fix this. And he didn't do that. I mean, he did bring in smart people. He brought in the smartest. He brought in the president of Harvard, Larry Summers, right? And he still fucked it up. And so for me and for a lot of my friends, the experience of the Obama years was really, really frustrating. And so that's when I decided I had to write. I had to understand that. And then once you dig into that, then you're like, and then the Clinton administration is the same deal. I mean, Clinton was beyond frustrating. He was a Republican, basically.
Yeah.
He got all their stuff done for them. He was Reagan. As I like to say now, he was Reagan with a human face, and once you start digging, it becomes enormously apparent that why these guys fail. It becomes obvious why these guys fail, because they have no intention of doing what you're hoping they'll do. They're not interested in that. So that's what I wrote. And again, it hit a nerve, right? The book was a big success. It hit a nerve, but it was weird. It also wrecked my rapport with the sort of media class in this country. And I don't know if you know this, but before that, I used to be on TV all the time in America. I was on NPR all the time. I could still be a columnist. I don't really like being a columnist, but anyhow, it was when something like this election happened, they would call me up, right, and they'd ask for my opinion, and all that stopped. It stopped overnight. It was fascinating.
You were
and
persona non gratis now.
Yeah, but what's weird is that I didn't particularly care because the book was this massive success in other countries. So I was writing for The Guardian at the time. My columns there were very good, I thought, and had huge numbers of readers. I did like more than one book tour for Listen Liberal in Australia. Nice. I was I was big in Canada, France. It was translated with enormous success into French. It was translated into German, not as much success there, but still, because this is happening, what I describe about the party of the left becoming a party of the professional elite, this is happening everywhere. And so it rang this bell of recognition. And in a lot of these other countries, you're actually allowed to criticize the party of the left.
Right. Yeah.
From the left.
Yeah.
You don't this turns out to be not
even
not
as
permissible in America.
Yeah. Oh God, even as a stand-up. I experienced that.
Yeah, no, you're allowed to do it from the right. If I declared myself a Republican or something like that and was saying this stuff, they'd be like, okay. But you're not allowed to do it from the left. But you are in these other countries. That's strictly an American phenomenon. This deep mistrust of people on the left. So it had this great life in foreign countries, which still goes on to this day. But then I screwed that one up with the next one, which was my book about populism, right? Which just like really annoyed the the Europeans, right? Because they've taken this word to heart. And they think that's the explanation for Donald Trump. And I'm like, oh no.
Well, then, so let's get to present. A couple days ago, as of the recording of this, what the hell happened, Thomas Frank?
Hey,
what happened? I know you've been writing about it.
It happened again.
Yeah.
I mean, what can you say? The poor Democrats, and I still am, a registered Democrat, and I voted for Kamala Harris, and I voted for Joe Biden. I felt good about voting for Biden, by the way, but I even voted for Hillary Clinton, and because I'm still loyal to them. But she lost, and it looks like Trump has won, not just eked out a victory as he did in 2016, but won quite overwhelmingly.
Yeah,
he's got over 300. Votes in the Electoral College, and he won it looks like right now, it looks like he won the popular vote, which no Republican has done in 20 years.
Were you surprised? What was your prediction?
I wasn't surprised. I can show you emails between my friends. I had to keep my mouth shut. I haven't been on Twitter in a long time. And nobody was asking my opinion except for my friends. And so I was saying, like, hey, guys, the asshole has got this one. And because we knew that if Trump always underperforms in the polls, and the polls were showing them in a dead heat. And if Trump if it's neck and neck, and we know that the polls always underestimate his strength, then he's obviously, he's got it. And also, it's just look at the campaigns. I mean, Kamala Harris was going around with Liz Cheney. That's not going to persuade anybody. She was very good in talking about two things. One was abortion. She was very persuasive on that. And the other was the threat that Trump represents to democracy. And even if you agree with that, and I did, by the way, I'm not, I think she's not wrong about that. I also happen to know that is not persuasive to the vast majority of Americans for a very simple reason. They lived through Trump the first time around, and none of those things happened. You can't cry wolf endlessly, and then the wolf shows up and nobody believes you, and that's exactly what just happened. You remember when he first got elected? They were talking about Watergate before he even arrived in D.C. They were talking about Russiagate. They talked about that steadily for 4 years.
4 years,
and it all turned out to be crap.
Right.
And you can't come back after and yell the same thing over and over and over and expect it to resonate with people.
Well, and now I think you're seeing, at least like in the terminally online spaces, you're seeing an overcorrection, because for so many years you had this, everything was hunky-dory until Trump showed up, which is total bullshit. I mean, that's total bullshit.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I mean, you and I both know that. Well, I don't know. I don't live in Kansas City anymore. I finally moved out permanently. Actually, this year, about 2 months ago.
Really?
Sold the house.
Oh, okay. Right. I thought you were in DC for a while.
I am. Oh, no, I am. That's where I am now. Okay. But my dad still lived there until 2 years ago. He died, and I spent a lot of time there. I mean, it's my, I hate to. It's my favorite place in the world. I know that sounds crazy.
Kansas City?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never been, but that's a hell of an endorsement, especially since you're a guy who's traveled.
Well, I can tell you about this. So the neighborhood he lived in is one of the most beautiful places in America. And when the pandemic happened, I went out there to stay with him, to more or less, permanently. Not permanently. It was for like months, right? And then I would come back, but he was elderly, and he didn't often understand what was going on. He didn't understand that there was a epidemic underway, and so I had to help him, and I bought a bike, and I would ride around, and there was nobody on the streets. And all the, these lawn maintenance crews and everything, they were all gone. The streets were empty. There was no traffic. And I could ride for miles. So from where he lived down to this neighborhood called the Plaza. And I will tell you, when it's empty like that, it is the most beautiful neighborhood or area or whatever you want to call it in America, without a doubt. It's just glorious. And I loved it. I mean, I guess in that respect, I had a really good pandemic, and I would, cook steaks on the grill, and I would, drink Missouri wine and do all the stuff that I do. I mean, it's all in the past now, but right. Where were we going with this? So
we're talking
I was saying why? So one of the things is, if you ever, in those days, or before that, I should say, it's been a while since I did this, but if you drive to any small town, so Kansas City is one of these sort of green zone places that has, it wasn't a big industrial town. It had some manufacturing, but it also had a lot of other industries, and those industries are doing very well. So Kansas City big parts of it are still prosperous. It's not like Detroit or Cleveland or something like that. It's still very, it's a lot of it is still intact, and people are still doing well. But if you drive to any small town in that area, once you're outside of the city, and it's just like the economic ruination it is an incredible thing to behold. The downtowns are always boarded up, the banks, the newspapers gone. it's a horrible thing to behold. So it's a combination of things. We know the economic forces that have done this to them. It's the destruction of farming. It's Walmart. It's the consolidation of all these different industries. And people are bitter about it. I mean, they are real bitter about it. And you look at a map of, I haven't looked at Missouri for this election, but if you look at a map of Missouri for 2020 or 2016, the Democrats take Kansas City, they take St. Louis, and they take the college town, and that's it. And this is a state, Missouri was a state, this is Harry Truman's home state. This used to be like their state motto, show me. This was a partisan Democratic motto, if you know the story of it. It was like as democratic as it is possible for a state to be. And now it's total Trump country. Mm-hmm. Kansas has always been Republican, so it's less surprising, but you still see the economic ruination. I mean, you saw it when I wrote What's the Matter with Kansas. I wrote about it. It is a shocking thing to behold. If you're as old as I am, now I was just a kid, in high school and before that, and my dad and I would he was a mechanical engineer, and you'd go to these towns, he'd be designing some building or whatever, and you'd go to these towns, and the small town life was viable. I mean, this is hard for people to understand now, but a small town in the Midwest, there was nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. They had industry. They had a viable way of life. It worked, and now it doesn't. And nobody in either party has a plan for bringing it back. What do they say to them? Look at Obama. What do they say to them? They're like, you got to go get a college degree. You got to go get an education at a quote unquote good school. Well, that's not an answer. That's not an answer.
Yeah. Well, and they don't make it affordable either. You'd think if they really felt that way, they would at least get free college. So where do you get your hope from? Do you have any hope? And if so, where does that come from?
So, I wrote this article in the New York Times the other day, and you know how you do, you go through drafts, right? And I wrote it really, really fast, but the first draft was basically my instincts on this, which is no, I don't have any hope. But then
there you go.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't admit that to you.
No, but it's okay.
The reason I don't is because the Democrats, look, I've said for years, the only answer to with this ugly situation where the country is divided 50-50 and nobody can get anywhere. And the only answer to that is that one side has to beat the other really bad in a kind of Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, Ronald Reagan style landslide. The problem is a Republican landslide is no good. That can happen. It's not going to solve anything. And the Democrats are incapable of getting something like that because they can't see the problem. Look, the other way I put it, Ron, is there was a moment where everything I'm talking about, or everything that I want to see happen, there was a moment when it was possible, and that was 2008, because the system had discredited itself so badly. The financial crisis. Yeah. Everything was in ruins. The country gravitated to Obama in a way that I've never seen in my life. They loved that man. He did represent hope, and he did represent. I mean, he could have had anything he wanted. He had a mandate, a majority in both houses. He had the country behind him. He had the foreign countries behind him. He had the world behind him, and he chose not to do it. And we're going to pay for that, I think, for the rest of our lives. Oh yeah, that was the moment when everything I'm talking about could have happened, and it didn't. And we honestly speaking, we don't know why he declined. We don't really know the reason. We probably never will. I often say, until he writes his memoirs, but he writes his memoirs all the time. Yeah, he's on like volume 3, right? He writes nothing else but memoirs.
Yeah.
So no, we don't know the reason why, except for that the Democratic Party is completely captive still to this vision from the 1990s that I write about in Listen Liberal. This vision of you have to, it's all about the educated elite and having them sit around a big mahogany table in Washington and they'll figure it out. And if we just get enough smart people on the job, then we can solve it. And I'm here to tell you that has failed and failed again and failed a third time and failed a fourth time, but they can't. Well, they can't see their way out of it.
Yeah. Well, getting back to Obama for just a minute, do you think, as a guy who's met him, because for me, I mean, I believed in him too. And even when a lot of people were jumping ship, I really felt like, no, that activist from Chicago is still in there somewhere. He's still in there somewhere.
Well, and then finally, talked a good game. He talked a good game in 2008.
And then finally, when he said, I'm a moderate Republican, I was like, oh, now he's telling us the truth. And I just, it was heartbreaking from a political standpoint. Biggest letdown of my lifetime, and will probably go down that way.
Yep. So, to add to his failure on the question of Wall Street and the financial crisis, and then his failure on healthcare. So when he did this famous pivot to healthcare, I was like, all right, but let's get something good. Not something half-assed. Don't blow your mandate on something like
Mitt Romney's plan.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what he did. And so I was okay with him muffing the financial crisis, that opportunity. But Jesus. So the way I put it at the time, it's like history dealt this guy 4 aces and he contrived to lose. It's like, how do you do that? How do you do that? I'll tell you a story. And then he beat Romney in 2012. And again, he had very good TV commercials that year, but that was the extent of it. That was just, and he's a wonderful public speaker, by the way. And do you remember this? He signaled in 2011, he gave a speech signaling a turn to, you can go back and look this up, signaling a turn to populism. And he came to Kansas to give it. It's the only time he showed up in Kansas, where his mom was from. His mom's family was from Wichita. And it was the only time he actually showed up in Kansas, and he gave a really great speech in Osawatomie, where John Brown had done battle with the slaveholders from Missouri, and where Teddy Roosevelt had given a famous speech. And Obama shows up, gives this great speech. Nothing comes of it. It's just more crap about education and how that's going to solve everything, is if we all go out and get a college degree. And it's like, what a letdown. And he beats Mitt Romney, but he has no agenda for his second term. And he does very, very little in his second term. And I remember getting so frustrated about this that I went out and I was writing for salon.com at the time. And this would have been in 2014, maybe 2015. I went out and wrote an article, and he had this chorus of supporters in the mainstream media, and their line at the time was, well, the presidency is not a very powerful office. There's nothing he can do. Do you remember they would say this? It was just it was driving me crazy. And the presidency is fantastically powerful office. And so I called up all these different people in DC and said, this was the article, by the way. And I called them up and I said, what could Obama do, even though he doesn't have Congress? What could he do in his remaining 2 years as president? And they all had an answer. They all had an answer. The one that I always remember is antitrust. The laws are already on the books. He could go out, he could break up Google tomorrow, or he could, not break them up. He could start the ball rolling. He could file a whole bunch of suits. He could do it tomorrow if he wanted. The other answer was he should do really high profile speed prosecutions of the main culprits of the financial crisis. This country would love him. But at the time he still could have done it. It's now that ship has sailed. But the statute of limitations was still available to him. And, he didn't do that. And then I had a whole bunch of other things, like he has, because of the Department of Education, and the authority, the power that they hold over every university in America, he could have easily strong-armed them into, doing something about student debt, not, about the high price of tuition. If you really care about education, Mr. Obama, let's see you do this. And then I had a whole bunch of other things. He did none of them. Now, the funny thing is, Biden comes along and actually did start on some of those things. I mean, they were baby steps, but
it's just generous.
Yeah, it's all a great
baby step.
Yeah, it's all a lost
baby step.
Yeah, but it's all the great. I would say in a lot of ways the tragedy of Joe Biden is that I know you don't want to go down this road, but Biden is the only one. There's two Democrats, I would say, maybe three national Democrats who. Maybe four who understand what I'm saying and agree with it. And Bernie, obviously, Elizabeth Warren, Sherrod Brown, who just went down. But Biden, I think, is old enough to remember, Roosevelt. And he certainly remembers Lyndon Johnson. And Biden has a sort of muscle memory of what the Democratic Party once was. And he started, like you say, baby steps in that direction. Now, he didn't go anywhere far enough.
No.
But look, they just won this massive lawsuit against Google. That's fantastic. They didn't even mention that at the Democratic convention this year.
They didn't even mention that. And they didn't even mention how, I think, look, I am no fan of Biden. I was a Bernie supporter and I like
me
Biden.
Too. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. But one of the few bright spots of his administration, I thought, was the appointment of Lena Khan.
Oh, yeah. No, she's the best.
Amazing at the FTC.
Yeah.
And, they weren't highlighting how, hey, that some of our appointments are the only reason your grocery prices aren't even worse right now.
Yes. Wait. And I'm not a political, one of these consultants or anything, but just think, I'll let Kamala Harris off the hook here. She only had a few months to put her campaign together. If you look at her speeches, her heart was not in the economic stuff. She didn't understand it. She didn't care about it. She didn't emphasize it. It's not clear she got it.
Maybe politician isn't a job for you then. I don't know.
No. But somebody could have. Somebody could have, told her about it.
I know what you mean.
This is your winning message right here. This is how you do it. Look what Trump is doing. Look at the group he's reaching out to. Look at the group surely all his hopes are on this group. Disgruntled working class people now across the board, right? It's not just white guys anymore. This is a group. You got to do something to speak to this group as a class. And what are your options for doing that? Well, it's not campaigning with Liz Cheney, right? And it's not bringing out another billionaire, and it's not boasting about how rich you are, which I couldn't believe it.
You don't say.
Which they had a speaker at the Democratic convention actually did that. And, it didn't happen. It never happens because it's not in there. It doesn't ring true to them anymore. I'm looking for a Democratic Party that is associated with, it's dead. I'm looking for a Democratic Party that only people like Biden and Bernie remember, and Elizabeth Warren, that they remember. It's everybody else just knows about it from books. And it's anyhow, so that's when I want to be pessimistic. And I'm pretty pessimistic.
You don't say.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Ron.
No, it's okay. That's why I asked the question. I was curious.
Yeah, but you want to. I can also look on the bright side,
Only if you want to. No, I hear you. I think that analysis is spot on. I actually have a much less rosy view as far as the Democrats go and stuff like that. I think that Biden stepping in the way he did, the way the DNC was going to make sure Bernie didn't have a chance, that was a once-in-a-lifetime chance for a transformational presidency. And I'm not saying Bernie would have gotten everything he wanted. Of course he wouldn't have. But there's these thing called executive orders. He would have gotten something, and we would be infinitely better off than we are right now. Infinitely.
Yep.
So
anyhow, another great missed opportunity. Now, look, I hate to be too judgmental about Biden because he did He did go in the right direction. And I have a feeling that we don't know the story of his administration yet, but that Bernie was pushing him and he was listening to Bernie. But all that's just in the first, only in the first 2 years. And then after that, and then you have the foreign policy disasters.
Oh, it was a train wreck. And she wouldn't distance herself from it at all.
Yep. And inflation that kills presidencies, even if you have an argument that Biden is not fully responsible for it. And I'm willing to admit that it still is a killer. I'm old enough to remember what happened to Jimmy Carter. And before him, Gerald Ford. They were both wrecked by inflation. It's like you can't, if that happens, you are done. And there's almost no argument that can remediate that. Even if it's over by the time the election happens, right? It's down now to manageable levels. I get that, but it doesn't matter.
Well, do you see any kind of silver linings going forward? And it's okay if the answer is no. I'm just curious.
At this point, no. No, not politically. Look, I have a personal silver lining. I'm working on a project that I'm really happy about. I'm working on a great project. And I'm very pleased with it. And, this is why you haven't heard from me in a long time and everything. I've been working on this book. I'm going back to where I started with The Conquest of Cool, and I'm picking up from that.
So what's the new book? What do you want to share? Whatever you want.
Yeah, it's a history of the idea of creativity. Like, where does this idea come from? And how does it become, then it transmutes into the word innovation, and then it becomes, so all of these books, it's not apolitical, because this has to do with the modern day Democratic Party. They love the word innovation. Mm-hmm. Obama especially loved to talk about it. Kamala liked it too, but Obama loved to talk about it. It's always the mark that they don't give a shit about you is when they talk about innovation. But where did that come from? Where did the word creativity, which was the predecessor word, where did that come from? And it all begins right after World War II. It's a very interesting history, but it tracks with all the other history that I've spent my life working on. Anyhow, I am now fascinated by the story. Now, it's very possible that the rest of the world won't care about this, and I'm just wasting my time. But so Ron, you asked for a silver lining. I don't have one, because I don't think Trump is going to be able. We were talking about those small towns or medium-sized towns in Missouri and Kansas, and the people that I know and the people that I grew up with, and he doesn't have an answer for them.
Right.
He has rhetoric for them. He has very satisfying rhetoric for them, but he doesn't have an answer, and I don't think anybody on the scene does. And I don't, the best we can hope for is some kind of so, you talk about what he wants to do. The two big things are across the board tariffs, which will be a disaster, mm-hmm. and mass deportation, which is so scary. We don't even know what that means. And that could be like the worst thing in the world. It could be like, I don't know. It could be camps. It could be something really awful.
Oh yeah, no, I think so. I mean, the way he talks and the things he says, and yeah, I mean, it's totally possible that.
But either way, that too. If he actually does those two things, and there's this part of me says he won't do it because his business friends will say, this is disastrous. Don't do it. But across the board tariffs, that's a recipe for trade war, and that's like instant recession. And if you do if you deport people, I don't know, if you do it in a sort of moderate or marginal way, I can see how he might get strong wage increases out of that, right? If you remove a certain number of people from the workforce, but if you really do it, if he really were to do it, no, that's the end, man. You'd wreck the economy really quickly. So I don't see it, but then so we game this out. What does he do? So he goes down to, so let's say he does what he wants to do and he brings on economic a recession. He slows the economy down really badly. What does he do in 4 years? Well, let's say some Democrats come in, but I don't even know who the Democratic leaders will be. What, Pete Buttigieg? I don't know. It's just gonna be the same shit. Yeah. I don't see another Bernie figure on the horizon.
No.
No. And, but let's say Trump, actually plays it cool and he takes the hand Biden has left him, which is not bad. And he gets the economy going. And 4 years from now, he's a hero. And J.D. Vance becomes president. Yeah, you're talking about a Republican dynasty.
Oh my God! Yeah.
If he plays his cards right. Look, Biden has left him the inklings, the beginnings of a strong economic recovery. Look at the stock market right now, right? Now that doesn't represent anything for ordinary Americans, but it represents something for somebody. And it's possible, that you can, parlay what Biden left him into a strong economy. And if he does, hello, J.D. Vance. I was once on a TV show. I was once on a TV show with J.D. Vance back in my pundit days.
Did you guys sit on a couch together?
No, we weren't in the same room. It was it was in 2016. It was on a CNN show. So Listen Liberal was a bestseller. And so there was one guy on CNN who had me on repeatedly. And I'm blanking. Smirkanish was his name. And he was, I think he's pretty, I don't know what his politics are. I think he's kind of a centrist, but he was really fair to me. He was, and he had me on again and again. And he had me on with that guy, with J.D. Vance. And I remember nothing about it. I only, I saw it the other day. I found it on like YouTube or something. And I don't remember a word of it. Mm-hmm. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Cause we both had books out at the same time.
Oh,
have you ever read his book?
Isn't it a novel or something? I'm not.
No, it's a memoir. It's a memoir.
Oh, it is a memoir.
And they made a movie of it. So after when he got the nomination, I went to the Republican convention, by the way. I saw him speak I was within 20 yards of Donald Trump when he spoke. Mm-hmm. I was on the floor. It was incredible. But, so I went out and got the book and I watched the movie. And it's well written and everything, it's a sort of a compelling story, but it's just poverty porn. It's this guy talking about white working class dysfunction, and how screwed up all these people are. And you're just supposed to like gawk at it, right? You're just like, wow, those people are messed up. Look at that. Wow. Look at what they did then, oh my God, they took drugs in that situation. Oh my God, they did what, and that's it. And then he is rescued from this world by Yale Law School. He's sort of plucked out of this world by Yale Law School. And it's this very 2016 Obama style narrative. And that's the movie plays that up even more, powerfully, strongly, whatever you want to put it. It's a total Obama style narrative. It's not particularly sympathetic to these people. But he's totally changed his tune. Now he's the arch defender of the white working class. I know. And he actually,
air quotes. Yeah.
But he actually talks a pretty good game. He's very smart. He's very good at it. You saw the debate with him and Walz. He's very good at it.
Yeah, he was a good debater. I mean, it is frightening because I actually think that class, the Ron DeSantis's of the world and the J.D. Vances of the world, I think that as legislators, they will be way more dangerous than Trump could ever be.
Yeah, they're competent is why. So that's my big concern for the second Trump administration. His first time around, he was just flatly incompetent. The people he appointed were, I wrote a book. We didn't talk about this, but I wrote a book once called The Wrecking Crew about Republicans filling their administrations with people who don't believe in the mission. And this is Trump, right? This is exactly what he did, only like in a way that was beyond anything I could imagine. And, And I don't think he'll make that mistake the second time around. I think he'll bring in people that know what they're doing in a kind of evil genius sort of sort of way. Yeah, I mean, there's every chance that he will govern well. He's also, he's older now than Biden was 4 years ago. It's possible that he will just check out and leave running the country up to
the ghouls he surrounded himself with.
Yeah, with Vance or Don Jr. or I don't know, Jared Kushner. I don't know. No, but then there's a chance you'll see competence then, and I think that's actually more dangerous. Yeah, that's actually more dangerous than the idiot Trump you saw the first time around.
Right.
So no, I'm not. I mean, look, the country will muddle through. It's a strong country, and whatever. But there's 300 million people. We are intensely creative and productive people. Look, at the end of the day, this. I'm a very patriotic guy. I love this country. I love Kansas City. That's who I am. And the country will muddle through. So that's the brightest. That's my silver lining there.
Well,
Ron.
the thing specific last point, because I thank you for being so generous with your time. But like the one thing I was curious where you might stand on. I mean, because if someone asked me that question, like where do you get some hope from a political standpoint? The one thing I would be able to point to right now is what's happening in labor.
Yes. Oh, good. Yeah, that's true. No, there's like real organizing spirit, but that's a lot of that is the federal government had their back for the first time since Lyndon Johnson. You had a president who was willing to intervene in these strikes on the side of the union, which that hasn't happened since I was a child. Not every time. No, not every time.
So there's
a few, but there's real spirit. Now, the reason, again, baby steps, because you look at the percentage of the private sector workforce that's organized, and it's still very, very, very small compared to in the 60s or the 50s when it was like, at least in Kansas City, it would have been 50%, and now it's, I don't know, 7,
I think that actually is the figure. It's around 7%, but it is at least going.
It's
forward.
Yes, that's right. That's a good thing. That's all very good. I heard the funniest bit of what you might call good news the other day from a friend of mine, but it's just conjecture. Who knows? And I can tell you this story. He won't care. You know how in Minnesota, there's the party is called the DFL. Democrat Farmer Labor. Farmer Labor. This is because the Farmer Labor Party was a very populist organization in the 1930s that swept Minnesota. I mean, that's what the populists were. It was a Farmer Labor Party, and the Farmer Labor Party swept Minnesota, and it has this great, history of doing these wonderful things. I mean, they were really a left-wing party and elected a bunch of governors and did all sorts of great things, and then at some point merged with the Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
And my friend in Minnesota is saying, it's time to unmerge the merger.
I'd love that.
Wouldn't that
I'd
be?
Love that.
That would be a hopeful sign.
And hey, to bring it full circle here as we're closing, DFL, also a great punk band.
Who are you?
You never listened to DFL?
So I stopped cold turkey in the year 1995. I'm like, I told you about the war I was in, and so I gave up, and I said I'm never buying another record, and I actually never did.
You might have just missed them. I mean, they were definitely 90s, but yeah, it might have been like mid 90s. But yeah, it stands for Dead Fucking Last.
No,
that was what DFL was short for. It was a SoCal punk.
Yeah,
but well, where can people go to learn more about you? Where could they make sure they find out about this book when it's finished?
I've written all these books, Ron.
Yeah.
I have a website. It's tcfrank.com. And I've got a bunch like my populism book. I actually have all the illustrations from it are on the website. So you can check out the illustrations. And it'll give you a really good taste of what the book is about. But I think I have like most of the reviews and stuff like that from my different books. And I think all of them now, not all of them, but What's the Matter with Kansas, Listen Liberal, and The People Know are all, there's books on tape versions where it is read by me.
Oh, nice. You do your own audio.
In my stupid Kansas City twang. And yes, I read all the books into a microphone, and I'm pretty proud of them. I think they're pretty good.
Yeah, it's so weird. Kansas City is one of the few major cities in the U.S. I have not, and it's just a weird coincidence, but I've never done Kansas City, never been to Kansas City. It's just very, very bizarre. It's one of the few. I mean, at this point, I've played in almost every state, but for some reason, and I've played in other parts of Missouri, but I've never played in the state of Kansas randomly.
Well, the city is mainly in Missouri. Right. It's mainly in Missouri. I lived in a little part of it that extends into Kansas. It's called Johnson County. Mm-hmm. But now Johnson County is so large. There's this, big white flight phenomenon. There's a bunch of there's a lot of reasons for it. But the city has a lot of the vitality of it has moved over into Johnson County, Kansas. And so like Overland Park, which was just a little suburb when I was a kid, is now this enormous metropolis. And it doesn't matter anymore, but anyhow, if you ever do go, give me a ring and I'll tell you what to look at, what to go. Yeah, I mean most of the places that I used to hang out at. So Kansas City once had a really great jazz scene. Nobody knows this anymore, but it did. It was a long time ago, but little bits of it still survived when I was in high school. And my friends and I would drive down into KCMO and listen to bands and jazz bands and oh my God, and we drank a lot of booze. Those were the days. And we ate a lot of steaks and we ate a lot of barbecue. And it was a blast. It's a fun place to grow up. I don't know about, whatever. Anyhow, it's all over now.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Hey, Ron, whenever you want, man. I'm at your service.
That was Thomas Frank. Wow. Covered a lot of ground there. Check out his books. I recommend starting with Listen Liberal and The People Know. Those are the ones I've read. I've not read all of his work. He's got a lot of stuff out there. I'm looking forward to his new project. Music for the 1000 Podcast is provided by Andrew Saxon. Be sure to check out his podcast, the Baywatching Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Please do leave us a 5-star review. If you want to support this show on the sustainability end, you can do so over at patreon.com/Ron Placone. For Give What You Can level, you get all kinds of exclusive content, bonus footage, full stand-up sets not available anywhere else, insider info into upcoming production projects. And that's all for a Give What You Can level. We got a great community going. So I've also decided, executive decision here, we are going to do, I don't know if it's a bonus talks or addendum footage but I decided, Thomas Frank and I, we after the interview, we started talking music for a while, just as two guys talking music. And I knew a little bit about his punk rock history, but I didn't know the extent of it. And so I think we're going to do some episodes where we do additional chats on certain topics with guests, i.e. Anastasia Washington's kidnapping and music talk with Thomas Frank. And that is going to be part of 1000, but that is going to be only available to patrons. So something to look forward to. And if you want to be privy to all that once it starts dropping, patreon.com/Rob Placone. But anyway, 61, turn of another decade, getting closer to 1000. See you next week. Hey guys, Ron Placone here. Take your own 1000 challenge. No, you don't need to interview 1,000 people, although if you want to do that, go for it. Your 1000 challenge can be whatever you want. Maybe you want to call a friend out of the blue once a week. Maybe you want to read a book every month. Maybe you want to start a different garden every season. I guess that might be dependent on where you live. Look, the point of the challenge is taking on an endeavor that enriches your life in some way, and it can be measured. And then, of course, you do it regularly. That's what 1000 is doing for me and hopefully for you too. The main reason for this podcast and every podcast I've ever done is to build community. So take your own challenge. Then join our Facebook group. It's called 1000 What's Your Challenge? ? That's 1000 What's Your Challenge ? And post about what your 1000 challenge is and the progress you're making. All I ask is that people be encouraging of each other's challenges. This is personal and vulnerable, so be cool. There's enough negativity on social media. We don't need to add to it. For those of you who aren't on Facebook, hopefully in the future we'll be expanding to places like Discord, Reddit, but for now, we're starting on Facebook. And again, that Facebook group is called 1000 What's Your Challenge? See you there.